to rent is proving to be a fast-growing global phenomenon, and it represents a major shift in real estate ownership as we know it. However, in Australia, it's a bit of an alien concept, well, at least until now. Earlier this year, Labor put build to rent under the spotlight when it announced proposed reforms to taxation. They wanted to allow build to rent to create more affordable housing. Well, that's past now, but what is build to rent? What will it work in Australia? What does it mean for mum and dad property investors? What does it mean for tenants? These are great questions that I'm going to ask today of Dr. Andrew Wilson, Chief Economist of My Housing Market and Australia's leading housing economist. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Michael. How are you today?
Good, thank you. Well, it's been still simmering along in the background there in the news about build to rent. It got a bit of news earlier this year. So explain to us, what is this concept?
Well, look, build to rent essentially, Michael, is that a developer will build typically an apartment block, but rather than sell the apartment block off in individual strata title units and make a profit from that outcome, that the developer will hold on to the apartment block and rent them as an enterprise, so as a business, and make their income from rental returns. So they become a landlord in a sense, but a landlord on a building by building basis.
Now, clearly, if it was a profitable situation, developers would have done this a long time ago rather than selling off. So to them, they can make more money selling to mums and dads. And unfortunately, we're seeing what's happening with some of the buildings that have been completed to a poor standard. I bet if they kept them, they probably wouldn't have built them out of paper mache like they did for the unsuspecting investors. But why is everyone talking about build to rent now? What's the fuss?
The hook for build to rent, Michael, has been affordability. And of course, when prices were going through the ceiling, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, and we had, for example, very low numbers of first home buyers. So affordability was an issue in terms of home ownership levels in that short-term higher price part of the cycle. We also saw rents rising as well with an undersupply of property. And that meant that governments were concerned that the capacity to house the populace was being constrained. And of course, overseas, we see these build to rent models on a larger scale, but we shouldn't again look at overseas models as being effective in our local market because so many different elements are here. Certainly developers, the industry, the big end of town in a sense, were interested in creating business models, I guess anti-cyclical business models, to take advantage of government concerns over housing affordability and home ownership.
Overseas governments spend more of their funds in public housing, and we aren't doing that in Australia. And up till now, it's been left to mums and dads to do. Other than certain segments, I guess student accommodation is a form of build to rent, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it is, Michael. The problem with build to rent, and that's why we haven't seen it in this country, has been that it won't work in terms of its profitability unless there is a buy-in from government. But developers would require significant taxation concessions in regard to land tax and also in regard to the GST to make it profitable. They would also require some significant changes to planning laws and also tenancy laws as well. So this is something that would require a significant buy-in from government to make it work in any sense as it has overseas. And of course, now with the affordability certainly improving, lower interest rates, a surge in first home buyer activity. Prices have been falling, Michael, as we know. So there's not that same sense of urgency as there was 2 or 3, 4 years ago with issues of housing affordability and restrictions to access to our housing market. We don't really have as you said, a culture of public housing in this country anymore. Australians are generous enough to understand that there will always be those that are marginalised in terms of being able to find shelter. We have a responsibility to house our populace, and I think governments should directly be engaged in public housing initiatives, and they do that, to be able to cater for those marginalised. I'm not sure that big end of town and developers should have their hands in the taxpayers' pockets, government's pockets, to be able to fund these types of enterprises.
Well, like other segments of commerce in Australia, whether it's schools, whether it's hospitals, whether it's public transport, there is a mixture of private and public expenditure to help provide these facilities. And I guess the same with housing. And up till now, investors have actually done a pretty good job in stepping in where the government hasn't. And I think they'd get pretty upset if overseas corporations were able to bring foreign money in all of a sudden and get tax cuts and get incentives that mums and dads who are prepared to put their future on the line to secure their future wouldn't be getting.
Absolutely, Michael. And I think that we have seen these schemes that are designed to improve affordability, rental schemes such as NRAS, can actually cause more problems than they solve, because they create enclaves of perceived second-class suburbs, second-class areas. And what that does is it influences demand in particular parts of the market. We saw that quite significantly in Townsville, where there was a lot of NRAS schemes which did impact the private rental market in Townsville. I think that we have a good system here. Small investors are prepared to tackle the risks involved with being property investors. There are certainly taxation benefits that they can take advantage of, but there are risks. And I think by and large that does provide that 30% of the population with a reasonably efficient rental market. So rent to buy, maybe it's increased the conversation around public housing, but I do think that that's a role for governments, and not for governments facilitating profits from larger corporations.
Great. So now we understand a bit more about build to rent. Thanks a lot. Look forward to our next Property Insider chat next week, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Michael.